Good evening, everybody. I'm Dr. Tarang Jain. On behalf of the ESIC group of hospitals, I welcome you to the ISA Delhi monthly clinical meet. Before we start, I'd like to tell you a little bit about our ESIC group of hospitals. So ESIC is basically an autonomous body which has been formulated under the ESI Act of 1948. So the body was formed in 1952, and the first hospital which was started, which was PGIMSR Basai Darapur, was started in 1974. And now we have a total of 9 hospitals in the Delhi NCR region, which in total have a total of more than 2,500 beds and conduct greater than 35,000 cases every year. Cases of all specialties are conducted, including super specialties like pediatric surgery, oncosurgery, and neurosurgery. We are also running 2 medical colleges, PGIMSR Basai Darapur and the ESIC Medical College of Faridabad, and are running both MBBS and MD courses. And DNB courses are in the approval phase in ESIC Hospital Okhla and Jhilmil. Also, we are running a dental college in ESI Hospital Rohini, and we are also very proud to say that in the COVID era, our ESIC group of hospitals has been at the forefront of helping patients, with ESIC Faridabad and Gurgaon running as full-fledged COVID hospitals, and all other hospitals are running isolation wards and COVID ICUs. So, these are our ESIC hospitals and HODs, which have been very instrumental in running and helping patients during this period. In PGIMSR, Basai Darapur, we have Dr. Madhu Gupta. In ESIC Okhla, Dr. Archana Lakra. In ESIC Medical College, Faridabad, Dr. Suvidha Sood. In ESI Rohini, Dr. BP Singh. ESI Jhilmil, Dr. Meena Doda. ESI Manesar, Dr. Sameer. ESI Sahibabad, Dr. Sudhir Gupta. In ESI Noida, Dr. Jaswant Singh. And in ESI Gurgaon, Dr. Tina Sharma. Also, before we start, we would like to place on record our thanks to Dr. Nikki Sabharwal, without whom this webinar would practically not have been possible, and Dr. Umesh Deshmukh, Dr. Rajiv, and as well as Dr. Parul Malik. I'd like to now hand over for the Secretary's address to Dr.
Good evening, dear friends, respected colleagues, seniors. I welcome you on the behalf of ISA Delhi branch. I welcome you to the clinical meeting organized jointly by the ESI group of hospitals in New Delhi. So far, we have been having a stupendous, great October with a successful organization of the annual 2020 ISA Delhi conference. Also celebrations of World Anesthesia Day on 16th and 17th of October. And to top it all, now we are having this clinical meeting today on 29th of October. The month began very well with the successful organization of the virtual conference, which substituted for the ISA Annual 2020 Conference by the Sir Gangaram Hospital team and the previous office bearers. I must congratulate the whole team, especially Dr. Anil Jain, Dr. Narani, Dr. Girish Kelly, Dr. Rajiv Gupta, Dr. Dipanjali Pant, Dr. Anjali, for the successful organization of this conference. It was a new platform, but it was a stupendously successful, and it was a great experience to attend and to participate in this conference. After this, we had the World Anesthesia Day celebrations, and I must really thank and appreciate Dr. Nikki's efforts to make the celebrations reach each one of the participating hospitals by the way of the cake and chocolates that were personally supervised and organized by her. And I think it added a wonderful touch to the whole World Anesthesia Day celebrations. The first celebration was held on 16th of October by the ISA National. For the first time, the whole of India, all ISA branches and the ISA National participated along with the international faculties of World Society of Federation of Anesthesiologists participating in the 4-hour-long extravaganza of academic and cultural talent from all anesthesiologists across the country. I must congratulate the ISA National Office Bearers and the Governing Council for conducting such a wonderful experience for all of us. Then we followed it up with our own celebrations, Delhi ISA celebrations on 17th of October. It was a very well participated event, I must say, and there was a lot of enthusiasm amongst all the executive committee members and heads of departments. But finally, I must congratulate Dr. Nikki Sabharwal, our president, Dr. Usha, our vice president, Dr. Anuvijayant Goyal, who never ceases to amaze me with his financial acumen, and Dr. Parul with a ceaseless energy and tireless efforts, as well as our very, very enthusiastic governing council members, Dr. Ashish Dang, Arun Mehra, Amit Kohli, Arvind Arya, and Ranju Gandhi, who lent a lot of enthusiasm and energy to the organization of the whole program, not to forget the executive committee members, all the HODs, and especially the participants who had so much, talent on display that I thought perhaps we could start another entertainment channel of the ISA. I was really sorry not being able to accommodate some latecomers, and I think we should organize a separate program for them as well, because there was a lot of enthusiasm shown by them. I am sure Dr. Nikki and others will discuss and will try to organize another cultural program before the year ends. I finally extend my warmest regards and thanks to Dr. Rajiv Gupta, our National GC North Zone. He is ever smiling and ever ready to help in any manner whatsoever, and it was his guidance and enthusiasm that guided us for organization of all these programs. I would also like to report that we have finalized our IT service provider, and I thank Ms. Koel Mujumdar and Ms. Satya Mohanty for their wonderful work. We gave them a very short notice, but they organized the program on 17th and they made a good start. I hope and wish they continue to help us out in the same manner as long as it is required. Finally, I must thank each one of you each ISA Delhi member for their support to us, and let us all make our fraternities stronger. And lastly, I must say, long live ISA, long live ISA Delhi, Jai Hind. Thank you so much. Have a nice day.
Thank you, Dr. Ramesh, for this inspiring speech. I would also like to invite Dr. Nikki Sabharwal for the President's speech. Ma'am.
A very good evening to all of you. I welcome you all to today's clinical meeting being organized by the ESI group of hospitals. I am thankful to Dr. Archana Lakra and all the other HODs, along with the executive member of ISA Delhi, Dr. Taran Jain, for organizing today's program. Earlier this month, we had started October with the ISACon 2020, which was organized by the previous ISA Delhi office bearers led by Dr. Anil Jain, and it was a huge success. Then on 16th October, as you all know, we celebrated the World Anesthesia Day, which was organized by the ISA National. And on 17th October, we celebrated the Delhi ISA World Anesthesia Day celebrations. Now today, ESI Hospitals has lined up a great program for us, and I'm really looking forward to it. I'm sure we all will enjoy it. Thank you very much. Long live ISA, long live ISA Delhi. Jai Hind.
Thank you, ma'am, for always being there for us, ever smiling and ever helpful. I'd like to call Dr. Archana Lakra to introduce the presentations.
Good evening, everyone. I welcome you all. Thanks to ISA Delhi, Nikki ma'am, Desmukh sir, Parul ma'am for giving time slot to conduct this month of clinical meet. From my hospital, ESI Okla, we are going to present two clinical case report. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Today, I'll be discussing a case report on drug-induced Stevens-Johnson syndrome in a pregnant female. Stevens-Johnson syndrome is a severe, life-threatening, generalized mucocutaneous adverse reaction, hypersensitivity reaction, usually to a drug, which is characterized by epidermal detachment, mucosal erosions, and severe constitutional symptoms. So, a case of 25-year-old female. She was presented in casualty under medicine specialty with severe maculopapular rashes on the face, especially perioral and ocular region, and neck since 3 days. This is the picture of the patient. As you can see, swollen lips and severe maculopapular rashes on the face and neck region. So she was diagnosed as a case of acute meningoencephalitis 4 months back and discharged on tablet Levipil 500 mg OD. She was also giving a history of amenorrhea for 11 weeks. She consulted gynecologist who changed her medication to tablet lamotrigine 25 mg OD for 1 week, then 50 mg OD for the next 2 weeks, approximately 2 weeks back, and she was not having any other comorbidities. On examination, patient was well oriented. She was febrile with temperature of 99.9 degree Fahrenheit. She was having maculopapular rashes on face and neck with targetoid lesions on extremities. On oral examination, she was having swollen lip with hemorrhagic and tender ulcers. There was difficulty in mouth opening. Mouth opening was less than 1 finger. She was having redness of eyes with lymphedema, and rest other systemic examination was normal. So on the basis of history and clinical examination, she was diagnosed as a case of lamotrigine-induced Stevens-Johnson syndrome. These are the routine investigations which were sent and found out to be normal. She was having high beta HCG, and on ultrasound examination there was single live intrauterine pregnancy. Period of gestation was 11 plus 3 weeks, and simultaneously we sent the blood culture of the patient also, and later we found out that there was no growth. So we shifted the patient. How we managed the patient? We shifted the patient to ICU, and we had recently started ICU at that time with limited resources, and we wanted to manage the patient in ICU because these patients, they can show hemodynamic alterations, and there are rapid fluid shifts in this patient, and these patients usually they are treated as burn patient. So you want isolation, strict asepsis, you want vigilant hemodynamic monitoring, and you want to assess the fluid status of the patient. The next step was tablet lamotrigine was stopped immediately, and the patient or the ICU temperature was maintained where the patient was there. Temperature was maintained between 32 to 35 degrees centigrade, so that heat loss can be prevented. Then patient was admitted under medicine specialty, but simultaneously opinion from dermatologist, obstetrician and ophthalmologist was taken. And since the patient's mouth opening was there and she was not taking anything orally, we inserted the Ryle's tube in the patient. So initial treatment started with IV fluid. We gave 100 ml normal saline at the rate of 100 ml per hour for the first 24 hours. Then injection augmentin for prevention of secondary infection was started, and in the dose of 1.2 gram IV TDS after sensitivity testing. Then corticosteroid is also a mainstay of treatment in these patients. So injection dexamethasone was started 4 mg TDS for 5 days, and then BD for next 5 days. Then she was having swollen lips, so potassium permanganate compressions were given 3 to 4 times a day, and gentian violet paint was applied over the lips. For ophthalmic symptoms, ophthalmologist advised aqua tears 6 hourly per day and ofloxacin eye drops 0.3%. Then local application on the oral ulcers was done with Kinacort gel, and Zyte gel was applied, and she was started on soft diet from day 3. Now we will discuss the case under these headings. So in etiology, drugs are most common cause of Stevens-Johnson syndrome, which is and other causes are infections, vaccination, contrast agents and idiopathic. Drugs causing Stevens-Johnson syndrome are anticonvulsant drugs like phenytoin, carbamazepine, lamotrigine as in our case, then allopurinol, then sulfonamide drugs, antibiotics, mainly beta-lactam antibiotics, then paracetamol, then nevirapine, that is a non-reverse transcriptase inhibitor, which is a common cause, and NSAIDs. So what are the predisposing factors in Stevens-Johnson syndrome? If the patient is already having a previous history of Stevens-Johnson syndrome, then if the patient is having a family history of Stevens-Johnson syndrome, especially the first degree relative, then age of more than 40 years, then in gender, it is more common in male as compared to female. Then pregnancy is a predisposing factor as in our case, and it is an immunocompromised state. Then genetic predisposition is also there. It has HLA association has been found. So it is more common in Chinese, Southeast Asian and Indian descent population. Now, how will SGS exist as a continuum with toxic epidermal necrolysis? So how to differentiate it? It depends upon the body surface area involved. If body surface area is less than 10% involved, then it is termed as Stevens-Johnson syndrome. Body surface area involvement between 10 to 30% is somewhat overlap between Stevens-Johnson syndrome and 10, and more than 30% of body surface area involvement is termed as 10. Coming to pathogenesis, whenever there is drug hypersensitivity reaction, there is activation of major histocompatibility complex 1, which causes activation of cytotoxic T lymphocytes, and these T lymphocytes, they infiltrate the skin along with natural killer cells. So in case of drug induced Stevens-Johnson syndrome, this is a flowchart which will show what are the sequence of events or what are the sequence of symptoms which will occur in the patient. It will start with mild fever and URI or influenza-like symptoms, which will be followed by mucous membrane and skin lesions, mainly oral ulceration and conjunctivitis. Then there will be separation of epidermis or epidermal detachment, and that will result in extreme pain, loss of fluid and protein, bleeding, heat loss and infection. So we have scoring system of Stevens-Johnson, that is the Scotton scoring system, and 1 point is scored for each criteria, and you have age of more than 40 years if the patient is having any kind of malignancy, if there is tachycardia with heart rate of more than 120, if percentage of body surface area involved is more than 10%, then if serum urea is more than 28 milligram per deciliter, if serum glucose is more than 252 milligram per deciliter, then if there is serum bicarbonate which is less than 20 millimoles per liter, and depending upon the criteria which are involved, if more than 5 criteria are there, then mortality becomes more than 90%, very high. So as I have already told that we have shifted the patient to ICU because we need aggressive therapy for this patient, so that the patient does not develop any further complication, and if she develop, it should be managed and it should be identified. So so major concern in Stevens-Johnson syndrome is that to prevent any complication if it develops. So there can be skin changes, that is hypo or hyperpigmentation patches post recovery. Then there are chances of secondary infection in the lesions itself, skin lesions. Then internal organs infection are very common, that is pneumonia, hepatitis, myocarditis, nephritis. The chance of esophageal stricture which may result in dysphagia. Then various ocular symptoms are also there, and that causes ocular complications like dry eye, uveitis and blindness. Then there are chances of vaginal stenosis and scarring of penis, and the fatal complications like DIC and thromboembolism. So as I've already told you that we needed ICU because we need vigilant monitoring and we have to prevent any further complication, and if any complication develops, we have to identify and manage it. So this is our patient after 10 days, and after 10 days patient was shifted to ward and then discharged after 5 days. So her total hospital stay was 15 days and none of the complication occurred during the hospital stay. USG was repeated in order to know the fetal well-being, and patient and family was counseled regarding cautious use of medication. To conclude, it requires early diagnosis and prompt recognition to manage Stevens-Johnson syndrome efficiently. Then next step is to withdraw the causative agent. You have to replace the fluid. You have to follow the strict asepsis because there are high chances of secondary infection, and regular follow-up of the patient should be done. So the take-home message is that physician should be cautious while starting on any drug which causes Stevens-Johnson syndrome, usually in patients with high risk. Then the initial symptoms are oral ulceration, which are usually neglected by the patient. So whenever you are starting any medication which are known to cause Stevens-Johnson syndrome, and you develop oral lesions, then physician should be cautious and it should be taken seriously. Then early diagnosis results in it eludes the secondary infection and complication. Then patient should never be re-challenged with the same drug. If you know that this drug causes Stevens-Johnson syndrome, it should never be re-challenged. Like in our case, we know that lamotrigine induced Stevens-Johnson syndrome was there, so we will never give our patient lamotrigine again. And family members too should avoid these drugs. So this is happy mother and child, and you can see the patient, and you can see her child, and he was delivered on 9th of June 2020. Thank you.
A very good evening to all the esteemed ISA members. Today I'll be presenting a case report on an unexpected encounter with a foreign body in the buccal mucosa. The foreign body aspiration or impaction is a frequently encountered emergency case in the pediatric population. It is more common in children less than 5 years of age due to their habit of putting things in the mouth, and it is more common in boys as compared to girls. The delay in recognition of the foreign body can lead to serious morbidity and mortality. The anesthetic management for the removal of foreign body is a challenge for the anesthesiologist due to the sharing of airway between the surgeon and the anesthesiologist. Bronchoscopy, which is the most common procedure used to remove the foreign body, is a tedious procedure which requires well planning in advance, and it requires efficient teamwork between the anesthesiologist and the surgeon, and itself is associated with a number of complications. So I'm presenting a case of a 5-year-old female child who presented with an unusual foreign body, that is the bristles of a toothbrush stuck in her left buccal mucosa. The girl's father gave history of fall while brushing her teeth in the bathroom in morning, causing the bristle portion of the brush to be embedded in the left side of her buccal mucosa. The child reported in the emergency department, and after initial evaluation and investigations was sent to us for PSC. The child was posted for foreign body removal as an emergency case. The anesthetic management for this removal of the foreign body, occluding the airway, was a major challenge for us. This is a picture of the child with the toothbrush stuck in the left buccal mucosa. Coming to the pre-anesthetic evaluation, a detailed PSC was done for the child. The birth history was uneventful. There was no developmental delay in the milestones. The immunization was up to date. There was no history of any comorbidities or congenital anomalies. There was no history of blood transfusions or drug allergy. There was no history of surgery in the past. On general examination, the child was conscious, cooperative, and the nutritional status was fair. The child weighed 15 kgs. The pulse rate at the time of examination was 110 beats per minute. BP was 100 by 58 millimeters of mercury. There was no recent history of fever or upper respiratory tract infection. There was no active bleeding at the time of presentation, but minimal blood-stained saliva was dripping from the angle of the mouth. Extraorally, a tender bulge was present on the posterior aspect of the left cheek. Intraorally, the bristle portion of the toothbrush could not be seen, which indicated that the toothbrush was deeply impacted in the buccal mucosa. The brush had penetrated the buccal mucosa at the level of the upper second molar. There was no abnormality detected in the systemic examination. Coming to the airway examination, the mouth opening of the child was only 2 fingers, as the child could not open the mouth further due to severe pain. The Mallampati grade could not be assessed due to the toothbrush crossing the angle of the mouth. There was no loose or missing teeth. The neck mobility was normal. The TMD joint was normal. The spine was normal. And the nasal patency, which was also checked in the preoperative area, was normal. All the investigations were within the normal limits and the vital markers were sent. The case was accepted under ASA grade 1E. The child was NPO from the previous night. The child was shifted to OT after the investigations were done and the consent was taken. Antibiotic injection augmentin 325 mg and analgesic injection paracetamol 250 mg was given in the casualty before shifting the child to the preoperative area. Now, talking about the anesthesia concerns in this case, we had 3 major concerns. The one was the age of the child, that the child was a pediatric. Next was anticipated difficult airway. And the third was the sharing of the airway between the anesthesiologist and the surgeon. Preoperative preparation, the anesthesia machine was checked. The OT was kept ready with the necessary drugs, equipments, and the difficult airway cart. We had kept anatomical face masks of various sizes, oropharyngeal and nasopharyngeal airways of appropriate size, Macintosh plate size 1 and 2, Miller's plate size 1 and 2, pediatric bougie, stillet, endotracheal tubes both cuffed and uncuffed of appropriate sizes, supraglottic airway device, we had kept ProSeal size 1.5 to 2.5 ready for this case, tracheostomy tubes of appropriate size and large pouch IV cannula. The surgical options of securing the airway during the foreign body removal in case any emergency arises was well discussed in advance with the ENT surgeon. Now talking about the areas of difficulty in this case, for us the patient consent or cooperation was present, the child was cooperative and the consent was given by the girl's father. The mask ventilation was not possible in this case as it was impossible to achieve an adequate mask seal due to the toothbrush crossing the angle of the mouth, and due to the same reason, the placement of the supraglottic airway device was also not possible. For laryngoscopy and intubation, we were quite unsure as we could not assess the Mallampati grade in the child and we were not sure about how much edema it was there. And the surgical airway option was obviously available for us. So the plan for anesthetic management in this case, we had two plans. Plan A was general anesthesia with endotracheal intubation with controlled ventilation under direct laryngoscopy. As we do not have pediatric fiber optic and video laryngoscope available in our setup. And the next plan for us was surgical tracheostomy only. So the child was shifted to the OT after PAC evaluation. The routine non-invasive monitoring was established, ECG, NIBP, pulse oximetry and ETCO2. A 20 gauge IV cannula was already present in the left dorsum of the hand and IV drip lingual lactate was started. Sedative pre-medication was avoided in this case as this was the case of anticipated difficult airway. Anti-aspiration prophylaxis in the form of injection pantoprazole 20 mg and injection metoclopramide 2.5 mg was given IV. Anti-sialagogue injection glycopyrrolate 0.2 mg was given. The ENT surgeons were scrubbed and present inside the OT at the time of induction and prepared for emergency tracheostomy if required. The patient was co-oxygenated with adult size 3 face mask with 100% oxygen and nasal prongs was also, oxygen via nasal prongs was also given at 5 liters per minute. We did modified rapid sequence induction and intubation in this case as we assumed that during the trauma the child would have swallowed some amount of blood. So we induced the child with for injection fentanyl 30 mg was given for analgesia. The patient was induced with injection propofol 30 mg. Neuromuscular blockade was achieved with injection succinylcholine 20 mg. While cricoid pressure was being given. The toothbrush was gently lifted to introduce the Macintosh blade from the right angle of the mouth, and the patient was intubated with 5 mm cuffed endotracheal tube with stillet under direct laryngoscopy with Macintosh size 2 blade. The patient was receiving oxygen via nasal prongs at 5 liters per minute during the attempt of laryngoscopy, that is apneic oxygenation. So we were able to intubate the patient successfully at the first attempt only, and the successful tracheal intubation was confirmed with auscultation and capnography. Throat packing was done properly. Intraoperatively, the depth of anesthesia was maintained with oxygen and nitrous oxide and sevoflurane mixture. Injection atracurium was given for muscle relaxation intraoperatively. Injection PCM 225 mg was given for analgesia at the end of the surgery. Injection dexamethasone 2 mg was given for airway edema. Warm ringer lactate was given by running the IV fluid through a fluid warmer, and adequate insulation of the body parts was done to prevent the hypothermia. The intraoperative period was uneventful with minimal blood loss. The toothbrush was removed and the wound was sutured. Now this is the pic of the child with the toothbrush embedded. So we can see the wound here, and it was quite a big wound and it was sutured after the toothbrush was removed. And this is a picture of the toothbrush. At the end of the surgery, a gentle laryngoscopy was done to rule out any bleeding from the suture site. The child was reversed with 0.75 mg of neostigmine and 0.15 mg of glycopyrrolate. The child was extubated when fully awake, obeying commands. Oxygen saturation was more than 97% and the child was generating a tidal volume more than 5 ml per kg, and after confirming that there was no apparent airway edema in the lateral position. Post-operatively, the patient was pain and nausea vomiting free. The patient was kept NPO for 6 hours and shifted to ward after a period of monitoring. Coming to the discussion of this case, the implantation of a foreign body in the oral cavity is common in young children, but implantation of a toothbrush in the pharynx is not common. This is a case report where a toothbrush traumatized the buccal soft tissues so severely that the brush got embedded inside the buccal mucosa and required surgical intervention for removal. So talking about the anesthetic challenges faced by us in this case, the first and foremost challenge for us was a difficult bag and mask ventilation, which is obviously impossible to achieve an adequate seal in this case. And the next was the same case with the difficult supraglottic device placement due to the toothbrush crossing the angle of the mouth. And as I told earlier, the laryngoscopy and tracheal intubation was also, we were not very sure about this as we could not assess the Mallampati grade of the child and we had no idea how much edema was present. And the last option, which was surgical airway, was possible and available. The ideal plan in this case for us would have been an awake fiber optic intubation, as the child was cooperative and we wouldn't have had to touch the toothbrush or move the toothbrush, which can itself would have, if the toothbrush would have dislodged, it would have caused bleeding. And even deep sedation was not an option for us in this case, as the toothbrush was deeply impacted. Now, pediatric difficult airway. Difficulty in the airway management is one of the major reasons for the anesthesia-related cardiac arrest, death, and brain injury in small children. The presence of a difficult airway has been identified as a significant patient factor associated with increased morbidity and mortality. The reported incidence of difficult airway in infants is 0.24 to 4.7% and in older children it's 0.07 to 0.7%. Now, a difficult airway is an airway which is defined as difficulty with face mask ventilation, direct or indirect laryngoscopy, tracheal intubation, supraglottic airway device placement, or front of neck access, that is surgical airway. Now, this is the flow chart of difficult airway society of difficult bag and mask ventilation during routine induction of anesthesia in a child aged 1 to 8 years. And this is the All India Difficult Airway Society 2016 guidelines for an unanticipated difficult tracheal intubation in pediatric population. Now, there are few similar case reports which have been reported in the past. One of the cases, Moran reported a case of toothbrush embedded in the buccal soft tissues, but in this case, the toothbrush was removed as it was not deeply embedded. It was removed under IV sedation itself. Injection ketamine was given. Another case is a case of where Sagar et al. Reported a case of life-threatening penetrating oropharyngeal trauma in a child by a toothbrush, which had penetrated the posterolateral part of the pharyngeal wall and reached the parapharyngeal space beyond the carotid sheath and pushed it laterally at the level of the second cervical vertebrae. The penetrating injuries of the oral cavity and the pharynx with or without impaction can lead to massive bleeding, retropharyngeal abscess, mediastinitis, carotid artery thrombosis, JVP thrombosis, and cranial nerve important. The proper investigations should be done which are necessary to know the precise location of the foreign body and its relation to the nearby critical structures. The CT scan and MRI may also be necessary in some cases. Broad spectrum antibiotics during the covering anaerobic coverage are very important to prevent sepsis. The tetanus prophylaxis is also necessary in unimmunized patients. Anti-inflammatory agents like steroids may be necessary prior to the surgical intervention to reduce the edema of the oral cavity, and it also increases the visibility of the impacted foreign body. Now, a few lines about the role of apneic oxygenation. The providing continuous oxygenation to the airway and lungs without ventilation during the airway management is called apneic oxygenation. It provides a longer margin of safety during the airway management without significant desaturation, which allows extra time for us to secure the airway during the first attempt. The safe apnea time is the duration of time until which the critical desaturation occurs, that is SA2 of 88 to 90%, which occurs following the cessation of breathing or ventilation. The oxygen is provided by a nasal cannula prior to the administration of neuromuscular blocker and it is continued until the confirmation of the endotracheal tube placement. These are the references. Thank you.
We find it in the everyday. Those everyday moments when we can be there. The hundreds of sunrises or hours logged on the move. It's those moments that make us, where the smallest things can make a difference. Our decisions and experiences, they shape us into who we are. They can take us halfway across the globe, to new places, places that we barely know. Within these experiences, we gain insight that allows us to remember that we are all connected. Like the ripple of a sound wave, our actions have the power to impact those around us. Our actions can save lives. Our tools, training, skill set, education, it all comes down to one thing: care. Care is about connection, the connection that is made with others. It's about having something that works right every time. And at the end of the day, we know that our job is done. We think, concept, and craft every element of what we make. The time has been spent and actions and decisions made that make it all worth it. At the end of the day, or the beginning of a new one, we are driven by ingenuity and fueled by the passion to innovate. It comes back to this, that those everyday moments are the ones that matter. This is to all of you that work hard every day to care for others. From saving a life to seeing a new one for the first time. To those that make the sacrifices, the hours away from home and time spent on call, all of you, your experience, your care, you make us who we are.
Dr. Samir Shankar Raj, Specialist in Anesthesiology, SIC Hospital, Manesar. I am here to present a case of sudden bradycardia and impending cardiac arrest by intramyometrial vasopressin in laparoscopic myectomy. Vasopressin, a posterior pituitary hormone, is used to reduce blood loss during myectomy. Although intramyometrial vasopressin is just in good hemostasis, but it may cause adverse cardiac events like bradycardia, arrhythmia, pulmonary edema, and cardiac arrest. We here report a case of severe bradycardia and impending cardiac arrest caused by intramyometrial infiltration of 13 units of vasopressin. A 27-year-old woman, a case of primary infertility with posterior intramyometrial fibroid, was posted for elective hysterolaparoscopy. There was no past medical or surgical history. Her routine investigation, including ECG, was normal. She was a SA grade 1 patient, intraoperatively monitored by 5-lead ECG, NIBP, pulse oximeter, and ETCO2. Her baseline vitals were pulse 82, BP 120 by 76. SpO2 was 100% on room air with NSR. The choice of anesthesia was general anesthesia with sedation. Combined spinal epidural was given at L3 L4 space with epibuprofen 0.5% 3.5 ml along with 25 microgram of fentanyl. Level of spinal anesthesia achieved was T6. Dexmedetomidine infusion was given as loading dose at the rate of 1 microgram per kg per hour for first 10 minutes, followed by 0.5 microgram per kg per hour as maintenance dose. Injection fentanyl 50 microgram was given before insufflation of pneumoperitoneum. Intraoperatively, all vitals remained stable till hysteroscopy. Before myectomy, 180 ml of intramyometrial vasopressin was injected in the dilution of 20 units in 300 ml, that is 15 ml per unit. In total, 12 units was injected after negative aspiration. Within 2 minutes of vasopressin infiltration, patient developed sudden bradycardia and with severe hypotension. Her heart rate dropped to 20 beats per minute and hypotension as evident by systolic BP of 70 mm per mercury. At this point, all her peripheral pulses, radial and brachial, were absent, and there was severe facial pallor. But the patient had normal SpO2 and ETCO2, which indicated adequate perfusion. Pneumoperitoneum was immediately deflated. Injection atropine 0.6 mg was given at interval of 30 seconds and 1 minute. IV crystalloids were also simultaneously started, with heart rate improving to 60 to 70 beats per minute and blood pressure value improving to 90 by 60 mm mercury. SpO2 and ETCO2 were normal throughout the surgery. Consciousness level of patient could not be assessed as she was on dexmedetomidine infusion. Half an hour after resuscitation, open myectomy was started and successfully completed with vitals stable. Vasopressin, an antidiuretic hormone, has a strong vasoconstrictive effect on smooth muscles. Direct vasoconstrictor acts by stimulating contraction of myometrial cells in the uterus via V2 receptors. The half-life of vasopressin is 24 minutes as compared to a very short half-life of epinephrine 2 minutes and oxytocin 10 minutes, which makes it a very superior agent for achieving hemostasis. The proven efficacy of vasopressin in varied doses in decreasing blood loss has been there in the literature. Below mentioned are the published reports of adverse cardiac events by vasopressin like bradycardia, hypotension, arrhythmia, atrioventricular block, pulmonary edema, and even cardiac arrest. Pathophysiology of advanced cardiac events. There are three kinds of vasopressin receptors: V1, V2, and V3. V1 and V2 receptors are located in the periphery. V3 receptors are found in CNS. Vasopressin produces generalized constriction of most blood vessels, including coronary vessels, which results in increase in blood pressure. This sudden hypertension induces sympathoinhibitory reflex by activating baroreceptors in the aortic arch and carotid sinus, resulting in lowering of cardiac contractility and heart rate. In the collecting tubules, vasopressin acts on V2 receptors, causing water retention, and it also acts on area postrema of brain to decrease cardiac output. Thus, there is a decrease in the heart rate and cardiac output as a result of coronary vasoconstriction, decreased blood flow, altered sympathetic tone, and potentiated varoreflex in response to generalized vasoconstriction, which results in bradycardia, global hypotension, and in severe cases cardiac arrest. Contribution of laparoscopy. Further risk factors associated with laparoscopy. Pneumoperitoneum with CO2 stretches the peritoneum, which induces the vagal-mediated cardiovascular reflex, leading to bradycardia. Tendenberg position also leads to increased venous return, resulting in increase in stroke volume and cardiac output, thereby activating baroreceptors further, which may lower the heart rate by diminishing sympathetic activity. Treatment. Identification of the situation is very important. Cardiac life support measures as and when required, and atropine for bradycardia. Vasopressin has short half-life, so early recognition and correct resection result in successful outcome. Caution is required using vasopressin inotropes. Non-invasive blood pressure measurement based on oscillometric waveform of blood flow may not be truly applicable in the setting of peripheral vasospasm and can lead to administration of additional inotropic drugs that can contribute to iatrogenic cardiovascular morbidity like myocardial injury and pulmonary edema. So it has also been proposed to measure central blood pressure using preoperative placement of central arterial catheter, as peripheral vasospasm with central hypertension may give misleading clinical sign. So whenever we encounter a patient of vasopressin-induced severe bradycardia with all the peripheral pulses absent, one has to be very careful while using inotropes, whether to use the inotropes or not. Central arterial catheter placement is very useful in these settings, but it may not be possible to put central arterial line in every patient in all the settings. Food for thought. NIV measurement based on oscillometric waveform of blood flow may not be truly applicable in the setting of peripheral vasospasm and can lead to administration of additional inotropic drugs that can contribute to iatrogenic cardiovascular morbidity. Thus, the role of central blood pressure measurement using preoperative placement of central arterial catheter, as peripheral vasospasm with central hypertension may give misleading clinical signs. In case invasive cardiac monitoring is not performed, palpable carotid pulses and normal value of EtCO2 can help in differentiating peripheral vasospasm from global hypotension. Conclusion. Vasopressin is cost-effective agent in reducing blood loss during myomectomy. Cardiovascular complications may occur with vasopressin use in varied doses. A safe dose and concentration of vasopressin still needs to be determined. The amount of blood loss saved during myomectomy using vasopressin and the rare but potentially serious cardiovascular complications caused by its use needs to be weighted using risk-benefit analysis in larger, well-randomized controlled trials. Whether we may consider invasive monitoring using central arterial line in women undergoing myomectomy with vasopressin use also needs to be addressed in future.
Myself, Dr. Abneet, Senior Resident, Department of Anesthesia, ASIC, Faridabad. I am going to present my seminar on the topic spinal block characteristics of intrathecal to chloroprocaine following addition of dexmedetomidine versus fentanyl in Hernior-Haffey randomized controlled double-blind study under the guidance of Dr. Suvidha Sood, HOD, Department of Anesthesia, ESIC, Faridabad. Introduction. Subarachnoid block preferred for Hernior-Haffey over general anesthesia. Chloroprocaine has significantly shorter duration of action than lignocaine. It has around 60 minutes and lignocaine has a duration of around 90 minutes. Chloroprocaine is used usually for surgery of duration less than 60 minutes. Adjuvants are used with chloroprocaine like fentanyl, dexmedetomidine, midazolam, etc. Aim of this study is to compare spinal block characteristics of chloroprocaine following addition of dexmedetomidine versus fentanyl as an adjuvant. The primary objective is for characteristics of sensory and motor block in terms of onset, duration, and quality of post-op analgesia. The secondary objective is to measure the hemodynamic characteristics and adverse effects. Material and method. Written and informed consent was taken from the patient. Unilateral inguinal herniorrhaphy was performed. Duration of the study was of 1 year. Inclusion criteria was ASA grade 1 and 2 of age group 18 to 60 of either sex population. Exclusion criteria was any comorbid conditions, contraindications to spinal anesthesia, any known allergy to studied drugs. Material and method. Cervical block was given using 25 gauge Quincke needle in a sitting position under full aseptic precautions. Perioperative hemodynamic monitoring was done. Pinprick method was used for assessing the sensory block. Romage scale was used for motor block assessment. Visual analog scale was used for measuring the post-operative pain. RSS for sedation. Any other adverse effect was measured. Sample size was calculated with taking 5% alpha error, 20% beta error, and confidence level of 95%. Power of study to be 80% and margin of error of 10%. This formula was used and sample size was 126. Statistical analysis was done using this software. Randomization was done in 3 groups of 42 each. Each had received 40 milligram of 1% chlorprocaine with different adjuvants. Total volume was taken as 4.5 ml. Group C with normal saline, Group D with dexmedetomidine 10 microgram, Group F with fentanyl 25 microgram. The flowchart for the study was total 126 patients were taken, of which 9 were dropouts who were converted to GA. So 117 analyzed in this study. Group C was having 38, Group D 39, and Group F 40 patients. Looking to the sensory block characteristics, time to reach T10 in the Group C, that is chlorprocaine group. The time to reach T10 was delayed, and in Dexam the time to reach was earlier, 6.03 minutes, and in Group F it was 6.3 minutes. 2-segment regression time was maximum in case of dexmedetomidine. In Group C it was 54 minutes, and in Group F it was 70 minutes. Total duration was 60 minutes in chlorprocaine, 96 minutes in dexmedetomidine, and 79 minutes in case of fentanyl group. Motor block characteristics. Onset time was 5 minutes in dexmedetomidine group, in chlorprocaine group 8.2 minutes, and in fentanyl group it was 7 minutes. The total duration of the motor block was 41 minutes in chlorprocaine group, dexmedetomidine 83 minutes, and fentanyl 81 minutes. These are the comparison of the hemodynamic parameters in terms of heart rate, diastolic, systolic, and vena arterial pressure. Rescue analgesics. Time of the first dose was delayed in case of dexmedetomidine, that it was 124 minutes on an average, and in fentanyl it was 116 minutes, and in chlorprocaine group it was 80 minutes. Total dose of the rescue analgesics given in 24 hours, it was maximum in plain chlorprocaine group 142 milligrams, in dexmedetomidine group 91 milligrams, and in fentanyl group 93 milligrams. Adverse effects all were showing equivalent, but the hypotension and bradycardia was maximum in dexmedetomidine group. The nausea was equal in both fentanyl and dexmedetomidine group. Shivering was seen more in dexmedetomidine group, and pruritus and vomiting was maximum in the fentanyl group. These all are the references I have taken. So we have concluded that addition of dexmedetomidine as adjuvant to chlorprocaine prolong the duration of the sensory block and also improve the post-op analgesia as compared to the fentanyl. However, there were no difference in the post-op analgesia between the fentanyl and dexmedetomidine.
Tuorun King Take self-developed video laryngoscope using professional video imaging and superfine extension arm achieves rapid and accurate tracheal intubation and saves lives of patients in critical moments. Laryngoscope extension arm. Observe the monitors pull the intubation stylet and laryngoscope out after confirm the correct position of intubation. After confirming the
Blockbuster Laryngeal Mask Airway. Blockbuster Laryngeal Mask Airway, a new type multifunctional device, is a tolerable airway tool, meanwhile with tracheal intubation function matched with Blockbuster endotracheal tube. Laryngeal Mask Airway consists of mask, airway tube, connector, inflation line, inflation pilot balloon, and check valve. The connector is composed of four-way connector and a wing-type fixed handle. The wing-type fixed handle is located on two sides of the four-way connector, and the laryngeal mask airway could be fixed to both sides of the patient's mouth via it, which avoids pressing the upper and lower lips. Matched up with fixed tape, the side fixed hook can rapidly and conveniently fix the laryngeal mask airway without
Lohr indicator syringe that Tuorun Medical developed is used for epidural anesthesia, combined spinal epidural anesthesia, to indicate that the epidural needle reaches the epidural space.
Infusion pump, portable. Easy filling and use. No battery or power supply required. Portable design, therapy not limited by body position and space. Conforms to the physiological and pharmacological mechanism. Comfortable for patients. Single use, more convenient and secure. Medications that can be infused include analgesics, chemotherapeutics, antibiotics, antiviral drugs, infusion for rehydration. The distal connector can connect to IV cannula, stopcock, anesthesia catheter, and so on.
Thank you everybody for your kind attention. We now have a quiz and there are prizes to be won. So please do answer in the chat box. And Dr. Neha is going to be starting off with the quiz.
उसमें ज्वाइन करो
Dr. Neha, we can't hear you.
Dr. Neha, Dr. Neha, your earphone might be disconnected. Kindly check.
Dr. Neha, you are still not audible.
Hello? Hello?
Yes, ma'am, you are audible. Now you are audible.
Good evening, everyone. Myself, Dr. Neha Sharma, specialist IGSI Hospital, Jalmer, and I am hosting quiz session today. As you all know, there will be 4 questions, and we will be waiting for your correct answers in the chat box. Now, without wasting much time, I would like to start with first question. As you all know that Stevens-Johnson syndrome and toxic epidermal necrolysis are 2 different spectrum of the same disease. I would like to ask, what is the other name of the Stevens-Johnson syndrome or toxic epidermal necrolysis? I will be waiting for half a minute. The answer is Lyell syndrome. My next question is, what is cafe coronary syndrome? What is cafe coronary syndrome? The answer is, it is complete and sudden upper airway obstruction caused by a bolus of food, usually wheat peas. As it simulates the acute myocardial infarction, so is the name cafe coronary. The victims of this syndrome are usually speechless and breathless, and they die without assistance. Now coming to the next question. What is the optimal dose of intramyometrial vasopressin? The correct answer is 4 to 6 units, which has to be given at the concentration of 0.2 unit per ml. The next question is, what is the cause of pain after intrathecal or epidural chloroprocaine injection? I repeat, what is the cause of pain after intrathecal or epidural chloroprocaine injection? The most common side effect of chloroprocaine injection is procedural pain. It is not hypotension, it is not bradycardia. What is the cause of such pain? The answer is, pain is due to the EDTA, which is present in some of the formulations, which binds to the calcium of the lumbar or paravertebral muscles and lead to spasm, which causes pain. Thank you.
I would like to now invite Dr. Mamta, Assistant Professor in ESI Faridabad, to give the vote of thanks.
President ISA Delhi, Dr. G. Usa ma'am, Vice President ISA Delhi, Dr. Rajiv Gupta sir, GC member ISA. We are also thankful to Dr. Parul Malik and Mr. Mohanty for their cooperation. And we would also like to thank Dr. Madhu Gupta ma'am, Dr. Suvidha Sood ma'am, Dr. Archana Lakra ma'am, and Dr. Seema Kala ma'am, and other faculty of ESIC who have been with us with every step of the way. Thank you one and all, and please enjoy a virtual cup of coffee. Thank you once again.
Okay, I would like to thank the ESI group of hospitals, all the heads of departments, all the speakers, and everybody who has attended today's clinical meeting for this very, very nicely organized meeting. Thank you very much. Enjoy your cup of tea or coffee. Sorry, we can't offer you any. But yes, thank you very much for this very nice clinical meeting.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much.
So have a good evening. Have a good evening. I think we can end the meeting here, Mr. Mohanty. We could end the meeting here. Thank you so much.
We would please like Dr. Bhavna Gupta, Dr. Dheeraj Gupta to stay online as they have won prizes for the quiz, so that we can get their contact details.
कैसे यहाँ से मैम चल कर दिया ना चलो मैम
चलो मैम एक बार Dr. Dheeraj Gupta and Dr. Bhavna Gupta, please stay logged in. Dr. Bhavna, your details though I have. We will send you the prize shortly. Dr. Dheeraj Gupta. Dr. Bhavna, could you unmute yourself?
Hello.
Hi,
ma'am.
Hey, so you won a prize. We'll send you the prize via Paytm. So I have your contact details. Do you have any idea who Dr. Dheeraj Gupta is? We are unable to contact.
No, ma'am.
Okay. Thank you. Congratulations.
Thanks a lot, ma'am. Very good webinar. Really enjoyed all the cases.
Very good questions that you have asked.
Even we had encountered the Steven Johnson syndrome, so I was little like the depigmentation. It usually takes 1 to 2 months. So that is why I was like.
So actually, both the photos were around 1 year apart because she was 10 weeks pregnant at that point of time when she got Stevens-Johnson syndrome, and this was post that. So we actually contacted her and got the photos. Comparison. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Congratulations.
Thank you. Dr. Dheeraj is not online. Okay. Yeah, thank you everybody for attending, and we'll close it now.